Yes, please. What's your question there for Dr. Zacharias or Abdul Murray?
Why did God put the tree in the garden to begin with? He ultimately knew what decision Adam and Eve would make. So why even put the tree there to begin with? Because it makes it just seem like we're just a big social experiment.
You know, the thing about skeptics sometimes when they ask us these questions, and I'm not saying it's you because I don't know the background from which you're coming, is oftentimes I wonder whether they realize we ask these same questions. You know, we struggle with these issues. It's not like we think these are invalid questions. They are very valid questions. But what does the question assume? The question assumes something very critical, that the answer should be coherent. Because a coherent worldview is what you're really looking for. You cannot be comfortable with incoherence. And the question that was asked earlier, the whole issue of how does one talk to a Stephen Hawking? The fascinating thing about the talk that Stephen Hawking gave in 1990 at the Lady Mitchell Auditorium, which was packed, on the question of is man determined or is he free? He went through about 25 minutes of all kinds of scientific arguments and so on, and his culminating statement got an audible response of, oh my, is this the best answer we can get? And what he said at the end is, yes, we are determined. He was under the stranglehold of determinism right from the beginning in a naturalistic framework. He said, yes, we are determined, but since we do not know what is determined, we may as well not be. That was his concluding statement. Yes, we are determined, but since we don't know what is determined, we may as well not be. What he's really saying is, since we don't know the answer to my the explanation for my conclusion, let us live as if it is not a legitimate conclusion. That's really what he was saying. So I say, when you're looking for a coherent worldview, look at it this way. What options would there have been for the great creator in the beginning of this? No world at all versus this world. Okay? Number two, creating a world where there would be no such thing as good or evil, an amoral world. Number three, choosing a world where we would only choose good, where we'd be predetermined to choose good. There would be the total constraint. So we've got three options. Nothing versus what we now have, no such thing as good or evil, or creating a constraint where we would only choose good and we would never make the evil choice. Or number four, creating this kind of world where there would be the possibility of good and evil, and we are given the option of the privilege of freedom and making the choice. Out of these four options, this option is the only universe and the only world in which love is possible. In the previous three, love is not possible at all. Love would not have been possible between the divine and human interaction. So I say this, sometimes these are mega questions and macro questions, and other times they are filtered down into micro questions in the fine-tuning of an individual life. I found the answer to this, first of all, from the negative. You take a naturalistic framework, you live with an incoherent world. I couldn't live with that. So how do I find coherence? In putting together the diversity in my own heart, which was put together by God. And that knowledge of a personal relationship with God would change not only what I did, but what I wanted to do in my personal life, gave me hope, meaning, and a relationship. Let me give you just two quick illustrations because I think this is critical. I've had the opportunity of speaking at one of the most famous prisons in the world, Angola prison in Louisiana. Abdu was with me, some of my colleagues with me. 6,000 plus prisoners there, 85% of whom are in life without parole. It was the bloodiest prison in America. Blood on the ceilings, blood on the carpets, blood on the walls. When a prisoner was checked in there, he was given a dagger or a knife with which to protect himself. And this warden comes in, this director comes in and says, I'm going to change this place. You allow me to do it my way. He put a Bible in every cell. He had chapel every day. He has a seminary that he's built in there. Within a matter of a year or two, it became the safest prison in America. Today, instead of a gang of thugs, they've got gangs of pastors going through that prison out there, and they're the prisoners themselves. We had lunch with them, And I said to the guy sitting opposite us, why don't you and get yours? He said, hey man, I'm going nowhere. You may as well go and get yours and then I'll join you. The guy who led in worship, a young man, I said to him, can I ask you a question? Because led worship so beautifully. I said, can I ask you a question? Are you here for a life without parole? He said, yes, sir. I said, how do you feel? He said, Mr. Zacharias, if you'd known why I am here, you would never ask me that question. He said, but let me tell you something. Out there, I thought I was free, and the horrific things that I did destroyed people's lives and destroyed my own. Now, inside prison bars, having found Christ, I have never been freer in my life. This is the most free I have ever been. Pray for my family. They're outside and think they are free when they are really not. And he put his arm around me and prayed for me, and there were tears running down my face. We had lunch made by the prisoners. The warden sits there, eats the lunch that the prisoners have made. Boy, you call that faith? You better believe it. And he does it. Why? They have found meaning by an individual life being conquered. When you know Christ, when you have that relationship, and your will is transformed to his will, you find out why you were made in the first place. And the crowd is just multiplied opportunity for individual conquest that God desires in every life out here tonight. I'll leave that with you.
Hi, I'm Naomi Zacharias, the director of Wellspring International. I'd like to take a minute and talk about Wellspring, which is the humanitarian arm of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. The vision of Wellspring is to identify and financially equip existing organizations aiding women and children at risk. Additionally, we work to provide individual scholarships to support education, healthcare, and basic living needs. We would love to hear from you, and we welcome your support. 100% of every gift designated for Wellspring goes directly to a project on the ground. Please call us at 770-449-6766 or email us at wellspring@rzim.org. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about Wellspring International. And now let's get back to today's teaching with Ravi Zacharias.
Next question, please.
Hi there. I was raised by a mother who was a feminist and is a questioning Christian at the moment. And she finds that there's some contradictions somewhere in the Bible that states that male have to be dominant over women and women have to be submissive. So just from a Christian perspective, does God favor a gender specifically?
And you know why? What I think, your mother has a fair question there. I don't think it's just in a vacuum or in any sense of just trying to be cavalier about it. Not just that. You think of the very nation that he chose through whom to reveal himself. He could have chosen Rome. He could have chosen Greece. He could have chosen Babylon. In fact, William T. Ears, talking about it in a piece of poetry, said, how odd of God to choose the Jews. But then he went on to say, how odder still are those who reject whom God chose. God, I think, oftentimes in life, for the human life, chooses the weakest through whom to make his strength manifest. If you were to ask me what really makes this world, let me dispel one idea here. You often hear a statement, men are more cerebral, women are more emotional. Nothing is farther from the truth. But I'll tell you what I have found. Both are equal cerebrally, but women are more consistent in willing to let the thought be connected to the emotion. Men like to hide from the emotional ramifications of the thought. So if I talk to my mother, she'd immediately connect the emotion with what she was thinking. With my father, you could draw circles around it because he'd run from the feeling. I've talked to husband and wife. We were on a vacation once, and they had both lost a son. And the woman was talking to my wife and said, it has put such a strain on our marriage because my husband doesn't even want to talk about it while I'm breaking up on the inside. They both had the same thoughts. One was running from it. The other was willing to find the greatest bridge in life between the head and the heart. So even in theory, the whole idea is wrong. Secondly, some of the finest thinking in the world has been done by womankind. You see it. So this myth has to be dispensed with. It's purely an archaic thing. But to your question, is the Bible dishonorable like this in gender? We've just had Joe Vitale, who is on our team from Oxford. She has just defended her doctoral dissertation at Oxford on this very issue and this very subject, demonstrating how strongly the Bible speaks of the equality of the genders and what it is God has in mind in the complementariness of the two. So here's my question to you. If God were a discriminator against gender, the greatest truth on which the gospel hangs is the resurrection. If Christ be not raised from the dead, our faith is in vain. Why in heaven's name did he reveal himself to the women to go and tell the message? All of Easter hangs on the testimony of womankind with whom he trusted the entire gospel. When the woman with the alabaster ointment came to him and those were frowning about her, he looked at them and said, "Be quiet. Wherever the gospel is preached, there shall also this be told, what this woman has done to me in worship." He paid her the greatest compliment, that the gospel would be carried to the ends of the earth, and this story of this woman's faith will also be told. He goes to Samaria, and he sees a woman at the well with 5 broken, shattered marriages. She was ethnically barred from the society, as it were, maritally broken and shattered 5 times. He made her the first evangelist to the Samaritan world. Imagine what an incredibly gracious God to remind us that none of us is superior to the other. We only have the same privilege of taking our distinctives and complementary strengths and carrying the message to the world. I can tell you this, I would never be here today if it weren't for the strength of my mother. And when my younger brother was 6 or 7 years old, he was dying with double pneumonia and typhoid. My dad had given up. Our family had given up. We were living in Delhi. And the doctor came and told us, my younger brother Ramesh, who's today the chairman of the Department of Pain Management at McMaster University in Canada. He was 6 or 7, dying. I remember seeing him as a bag of bones for the last time. I'm 6 years older than him. And I walked away from there bidding him goodbye. He was unconscious. My mother refused to leave. She refused to leave. She sat by his bedside, and we were all worn to the bone, including my dad. And so 4 of us kids packed up, taken back home, and all of us lying in bed saying, "We've just lost our youngest." My mother sat by his bedside. Whatever she was doing, I don't know, and in sheer exhaustion, for days she hadn't slept, and just by his bedside crying out to God to rescue her son. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, he began to move and he was very much alive, but just quite worn out and broken. And that need of life was coming back to him. And the next day, when we all were told to come back to the hospital, his eyes were open and his whole life given fresh strength. There was only 1 out of the 6 of us there who had the strength to sit by that bedside and watch what loomed as a tragedy and watch the triumph to turn into victory. Anybody who thinks that's weak and lesser doesn't understand reality. God is the God of humankind. And the last thing Jesus said on the cross for the redemption of mankind was look at a young man and tell him not to forget his mother, to make sure she was also taken care of because a sword was piercing through her heart. That is our Lord, who treats all of us with intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. And I thank God for the beauty he has created in this complementariness.
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, I've grown up steeped in church traditions. I went to a religious school. I still go to a religious school. And I feel that perhaps indirectly I've been taught that the most important thing about Jesus is his death. And I was wondering how true that is.
Well, boy, without his death, there is no gospel. Without his resurrection, the death doesn't mean anything. I once gave a talk, great question, by the way. I once gave a talk at a business. I was talking about Easter at Diversity Day, because they'd never had a thing about Easter done at this particular business. And I made this statement, and I think it's true, that Christmas without Easter is meaningless. Easter without Christmas is not possible. So you see the birth and the death and the resurrection all wrapped up into the same story. The story is a beginning, middle, and end. But when Jesus was asked, why have you come? He says, for this reason I have come. He's come to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the reason. Now that ransom is his death as a payment for sin, because what the gospel tells you and tells me is this. And by the way, if I can just have a short aside here, I love Jesus for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is he's not a salesperson who tells you what you want to hear. He tells you what you need to hear. It's a very terrible sales pitch to say, you're evil, come follow me. What kind of a poster is that? But people do it anyway. He tells you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, in distinction to every other worldview, by the way, which tells you that you can do it yourself. You're the one who can make it on your own, and I think if the 24-hour news is one of the worst inventions of the past 20, 30 years. I got a clap over here on that one. But one thing it does provide us, though, is ample evidence that man is in need of a Savior who's not himself. We need someone who's not us to save us from ourselves because of our innate evil and our sin. Jesus told us that 2,000 years ago. So we need someone who can redeem us, who can pay the penalty that we deserve. Jesus says, I'm that guy. Now what's interesting is, if he died and stayed dead, then how would you know he's right? He could be dead and, well, maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong, who knows? He's like everybody else, so maybe he was wrong. But he didn't stay dead. His death is the payment. When he says on that cross, tetelestai, when he says that in the Greek, it actually means it is finished, it is accomplished. It's a financial term, paid in full. It's like a stamp on a document. The debt is paid. That is done for us. But you can know that he was right, that he took away the sins of the world through that death because of his resurrection. If he died and stayed dead, no way to know. But he didn't die and stay dead. He showed his conquering over that death, his conquering over the last enemy through the physical and, I believe, truly historical resurrection from the dead. So the death without the resurrection doesn't really show you anything, but the resurrection shows that the death meant something. In fact, let me just put it this way plainly, it meant everything. Thank you.
Some years ago, I had the privilege of speaking at the United Nations, and they had asked me to speak on a search for absolutes in a relativistic world. It's a tough subject, especially in the early hours of the morning. And you get them in about 18 minutes. And what I did in my talk is talked about 4 absolutes that we really look for: evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. I said we all have the desire to call some nation an evil nation. You brand some nations evil nations. But you all also talk about justice. You want just societies. You all love your families and you miss your families. And then some of you are going to blow it ethically, and you need to be forgiven. Evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. So I said to them, where in the world did all of these converge at one point in history? There was pin drop silence. I said they converged on a hill called Calvary. And as that meeting was over and I presented to them the message of Calvary, they were lined up, the ambassadors. And one of them came to me, shook my hand, and he said, Dr. Zacharias, he said, I come from an atheistic nation, and I don't want to be here. My president asked me to come here. I hate being here. I miss being here. But I want to say to you, today I have found out why I came here. I came here to find God. I came here to find God. Recently, I was in a Middle Eastern nation where the Minister of Finance came and asked if he could talk to me personally. Some of my colleagues know which one I'm talking about. He doesn't want to be there. So much violence. He sent his family out. And he said, I'm only here because of my faith and the sacrifice that Christ made for me, that I want to do my part in life. To take one aspect of the gospel and make it the most important aspect is actually that which God had joined together. Let no one put asunder. It is the birth, life, death, and resurrection. They are all put together. His death was spoken of, prophesied, and so was his resurrection. Even Paul struggled with that I may know him, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. One thing the death of Christ does is answer for me the question of evil and pain and suffering that no other worldview offers. My colleague Vince Vitale and I wrote the book, Why Suffering? And in that I made the comment that God does not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil. He conquers through it. He conquers through it. So the cross is central, but it is not in isolation, because you and I do not need a guru. We need a savior to offer and heal that which is central to your life and mine. And the Cross of Christ by John Stott is one of the most powerful books I have ever read. If you haven't read that book by John R.W. Stott, it's an all-time classic. Please take it and read it. But it fits into the grand design of God's total plan. Thank you for asking that. And now I come to this closing. And so whether you're speaking at the Center for Geopolitical Strategy in Moscow, or the UN, or a university, or sitting next to somebody in a plane, the only answer I have seen is in the person of Jesus Christ on the 4 questions of life, of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And especially to you students, may I say this: you have a rare privilege. You have a very rare privilege. I didn't have the mind that you all do, frankly, and I'm not putting this up, but I would never have made it into a university like this. I lived for cricket. I wanted to play cricket. I was a sports person. I wanted to play cricket for India. That was my goal. I neglected my studies, never worked hard, ended up with shame on a bed of suicide. In about 2 weeks from now, I'm speaking at St. Stephen's College at the University of Delhi, probably the premier institution in the whole country of that specific nature. Anybody here from India will tell you St. Stephen's College, Delhi, most of India's students would never even get in. And yet the principal has asked me if I would come there and present a defense of the Christian faith. God has a sense of humor. I would never have made it as a student. And now they're asking me to come and speak to them. This is how God does it, because the coherence of the Judeo-Christian worldview deals with where you are. And you have 2 options to go with. And I'll close with this and give you what I think would be a marvelous response on your part. Your tensions are great. Your allurements are great. Your physicality is a strength, but also makes you vulnerable. You are possibly oftentimes at the mercy of an academic who wants to knock God out of you. This happens again and again and again. I hear it so often. I will tell you this: you reject God and your worldview will become systemically incoherent. You follow the truth where it leads, and in the person of Christ you will find personal meaning, and the meaning that God can help you carry it to the rest of the world. Konrad Adenauer, after the Second World War, was alone with Billy Graham. Billy Graham is not very formally educated, and he will tell you that. With a minimal education, God's anointed him. Konrad Adenauer looked at Billy Graham. Billy Graham told this to us around a gathering of lunch. And he looked at me and he said, "Mr. Graham, do you believe Jesus Christ really rose from the dead?" And Graham said, "Mr. Adenauer, if I didn't believe that, I would have no message left to preach to the world." He said, Konrad Adenauer walked out towards the window, looked out of that window and turned around. He said, looking at the ruins of his city, he said, "Mr. Graham, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind." Outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. Several years ago, when I was a young man just starting my ministry, living in Toronto, I was driving on the 401. It was a cold night, snowy night. I was driving in my little Volkswagen Red Bug, and I saw a guy on the side of the road thumbing for a ride on a highway. I said, somebody's going to run over him. I pulled up on the side quite late at night, about 10:30. I opened the door. I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "Can you take me home, sir?" I said, "Where do you live?" And he told me it was not near my home, but I was fearful for him. And fearful for myself, he's a total stranger. I said, come on in. So before he even said anything, I said, please give me your name. He said, my name is Lorne Lusthouse. I said, as we are driving, talk to me about who you are, and then I will tell you what I do. And as we were driving, he said to me, tonight's been another night. Same thing, liquor, fun, everything. He said, Ravi, I'm a messed up young guy. I'm totally messed up. He was stopping, pausing, thinking, collecting his thoughts. When I dropped him off at his home, I took his hand. I said, Lorne, I'm leaving out of town early tomorrow morning. Will you please see me when I come back next week? Here is my phone number and my address. I want to see you. I want to meet with you. He said, okay, and he took my phone number and address. When I came back, there was a letter waiting for me from Lorne Lusthouse. But when I contacted, I found out that week he had burned himself to death as well. And in my letter was this poem. I want you to think about it. Lost in a world of darkness, without a guiding light, seeking a friend to help, my struggling, failing plight. So all of you good people just go on passing by, leaving me with nothing but this lonely will to die. For somewhere in this lonely world of sorrow and of woe, there's a place for me to hide, but where, I do not know. For no matter where I go, I never will escape the devil's reaching, clutching hand or the drink of fermented grape. So out of my grief and anguish, perhaps some wandering boy will see and build his own life in this world, strong and good and free.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias.
If you and I were to watch popular programming today and think about the deep questions we really have, we come away wondering, is there ever going to be a meeting of the minds between what, quote, spirituality has to offer and the questions of the mind and the heart, and the longest bridge that we try to build in life, the longest journey between our thinking and our feeling. The world is incredibly spinning out of control in our times. I cover this globe, I crisscross it many times every year. It is nothing for me for an average year to do 14 or 15 countries. And I recall a few years ago being in Damascus, Syria, before any of this turmoil started. It was my 6th or 7th visit to the country. Syria is a magnificent land. One of the oldest inhabited cities in the world is the city of Damascus. You can still see the street called Straight, which the Apostle Paul refers to as the place on his conversion journey, and the Damascus wall, where he was put into a basket and lowered over that wall. And yet, a few years ago when I was speaking there, I was always called up in front of the intelligence authorities. They just wanted to alert me that they were aware that I was present in their country. Always went through the proper procedures, got the proper visa, filled out the necessary documents. I never ever dodged on those issues. So I was not surprised that the day after I came, they asked if I could please report to their officers. So here they were with military generals flanking the intelligence officer, and he looked at me and he said something like this: whatever you do, don't get into the politics of this region. I said, oh no, I don't plan to, sir, and I hope you know I never have. He said, no, I understand that, but don't get into the politics of this region. That is our warning to you. I said, no. He said, but Mr. Zacharias, we know who you are and what you do, and you are very welcome in our country. We hope you will keep coming back. So I said to him, may I ask you, since I don't get into the politics of the region, but you do, can you explain to me what is going on in the Middle East right now? And this was before most of us had ever heard of ISIS, before the turmoil, before the attempt to overthrow Assad and all of that. And he looked across the table to me and he said these words. I remember quoting it in a radio program shortly after I came back. And he said this: if something doesn't change dramatically, this whole part of the world is going to blow up. Those were pretty strong words coming from a man who was well versed in all that was going on. I had not asked him what he meant by that. Those were his words. And shortly after the onslaught began. He was one of the first to be assassinated and eliminated. And now, of course, tens of thousands in that country have just vanished and disappeared in a slaughter that is going on, almost reminiscent of what happened in Rwanda in the mid-1990s. And the world stands back and watches, and we seem completely handcuffed to know what to do about all of this. It was Malcolm Muggeridge, who was writing in the 70s, who said this: "It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over, a weary, battered old brontosaurus, and becomes extinct." I had the privilege of being with Mr. Muggeridge just a short while before he died in 1990. He really thought that the world was skidding out of control, and he blamed it on 3 or 4 major types of institutions in our time that ultimately would lead to a worldwide carnage. That's what Muggeridge believed. He was often known for his rather pessimistic view of life, but he was also a latecomer to Christ, and in his book, Jesus Rediscovered, he tells his story, and also in his book on Mother Teresa, which he wrote, Something Beautiful for God. But 10 years before that, Dr. Martin Luther King, when he received the Nobel Prize for Peace, said this: "I accept this award today with an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life which surrounds him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." 1964. Unarmed truth and unconditional love. I want to pause and ask you this question right from the beginning. Think of those 2 phrases, unarmed truth and unconditional love. When our entire cultural ethos is now being defined in a naturalistic framework with a scientific single vision, where naturalists think in grabbing the finger of one discipline, they are grabbing the entire fist of reality. What does that discipline have to say about unarmed truth and unconditional love, when both of those are metaphysical, if not spiritual, propositions? Whatever does unconditional love mean? What does unarmed truth mean, and why so? So as we head at a higher speed now because of the rapidity of change, and as someone has said, the faster you are moving, the farther ahead you had better be able to see. As we are moving with this high speed of change, are we aware of all that we are bringing about in our time? The weapons of warfare multiply rapidly, and those in control of the armaments are getting less and less accountable. It was Aldous Huxley writing in 1946 who said, "We are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, where it has become quite apparent that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends." It's given us great means. How are we going to define the ends? One of the great privileges of a university is that you study different disciplines so that you can find the unity in the diversity of the disciplines you study, and not allow just one single discipline to run away with a hegemonous goal in mind to dominate all of the interpretations of life. The realities before us are huge and massive. And if you take that macrocosmic view and then filter it down right at the tip of the funnel to the other end of it, what do I hear more often than anything else as I travel? And my colleagues will tell you the same thing. Whether we are at Uppsala University in Europe, or in one of the universities of India, or the Middle East, or in Asia, or here, the bottom line for most young men and women today is the quest for meaning. What is it that my life really means, and where do I find the source of meaning? On the opening engagement that I had this year, I've never spoken to such a vast, just once maybe before that, larger than that, but I was speaking to 40,000 university students in one setting on the 4th of January this year. They were in 3 different venues in a live audience, and then tens of thousands scattered across the globe. Now, there were, I think, 115 universities represented in that audience, over 40 different countries. And those who came to people for help, asking their questions. Fascinating what the top 2 questions were from this age bracket of 18 to 24. You might never guess it. The number 1 question was how to deal with the enslavement of pornography. Number 2, how to resist the urge to kill myself. Sensuality and suicide were the 2 major issues in the mind of the young. I don't know if they saw the connection. I am one of those who came to know Jesus Christ from a bed of suicide at the age of 17 when I lay in a hospital bed in Delhi. I know what that urge is all about. When all hope goes away and shame takes over and you really don't want to face another day. But I wonder if they saw the connection. In the first, you really dehumanize and denude somebody else. In the second, you've ultimately dehumanized yourself and denuded yourself of any value. So you see, while politicians wrestle with the horizontal axis of right and left, they have forgotten that there is an up and a down.
Welcome to the RZIM Academy core module. This is a training program for helping people to become more effective in pointing people to Jesus Christ. As you go through this course, you become better equipped to reach out to the people around you and have enjoyable, meaningful conversations with them about Jesus.
This is the task of Christian apologetics, to enable you to be more effective communicators of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Register at rzimacademy.org.
I want to answer for you from the Judeo-Christian vantage point, what does it mean to be human? What gives human life value? As I've looked at different worldviews and studied different worldviews, I have never found such a coherent set of answers as that which comes to us as presented in the gospel narrative and in the teachings of Jesus Christ. See, C.S. Lewis put it in these words. He said, when a ship goes into the high seas, it has to answer 3 questions. Number 1, how to keep from sinking. He said that's personal ethics. Number 2, how to keep from bumping into other ships. That's social ethics. He said number 3 is the most important of them all. Why is it out there in the first place? That is essential ethics. That's where you get your categories from. Why are we out there in the first place? Then we learn how to keep from sinking, and finally, how to keep from bumping into other ships. Within the Judeo-Christian worldview, we have at least 4 major sources of inspiration that define for us who we are. The first is in the belief that we are not here by accident. We are not the random collocation of atoms. We are not a blip on the radar screen of time, or an empty bubble floating on the sea of nothingness. We are actually here by design, the design of a creator. And in that created order, we are given the purpose for why we were created. And in that created order, there are 2 implications that emerge. Number 1 is we are given intrinsic worth, essential worth, not extraneous worth, not worth given by states or laws or cities or cultures, but that we have intrinsic value given to us by God himself. In fact, that's how one of the conjoining of the words of worship comes together, worship, where God himself is the ultimate worthy being, and from that we derive our very definitions. Intrinsic worth. And there are really two deductions that follow from this. First of all, let's remember what Moses gave. He gave 613 laws. That came on the heels of violating just one law. There was only one law: not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However you want to see that, the proposition is basically this: don't play God. Don't play God. Don't be the definer of good and evil. When that law was violated, do you realize how many thousands of laws we now need because every individual plays God? You get onto a plane and they tell you not to touch, tamper, disable, or destroy the smoke detector. Why such verbosity? Just say don't mess with it, and that's enough. Because in a court of law, a person can say, I didn't touch it, I just disabled it. I just tampered with it. So 4 different qualifications are given till in a court of law every statement can die the death of 1,000 qualifications. One lawyer told me you can no longer safely ask somebody, were you ever alone with that person in the room? Because that person can say no, even if they were, because in his mind he can say, if I were with this person, I was not alone. So the very word alone it signifies something that the moment you say, were you ever alone with this other person, that can be messed up. So now just for our health laws, we need thousands of pages. Think of all the other laws that have to be enacted in order to cover up 1 or 2 simple laws. Don't play God. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was violated, and look at what has happened today. A man can be beheading somebody miles away from here on television and play God. And play God. Someone else can be screaming out and saying, don't do this. This is not what God intends of us. But autonomy has moved to this direction where we have become a law unto ourselves. And the question that you and I have to ask is, what did God actually say to start with? Moses gave 613 laws because one was violated. And then Isaiah reduced them to 15. David reduced them to 11. Micah reduced them to 3, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. Jesus was asked by a clever man, which is the greatest commandment? I would have thought for Jesus to really play the cavalier man there, he could have said, there's one law and I'm going to give it to you. He didn't. He said, the laws are these, of the greatest importance: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, vertical, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these 2 hang all of the laws and the commandments, all of the prophets and the commandments. On these 2, because of the one, the second necessarily follows. Without the first, the second is with its feet firmly planted in midair. For the Judeo-Christian viewpoint, these 2 laws are inextricably joined. If I claim to love the Lord my God with all my heart and all my soul and all my strength and violate you, I am violating the heart of that very law that I am claiming. I was just telling some friends, it's been a long time since I even mentioned this, and I used to stay in a hotel in Bangkok called the Oriental Hotel, where a friend of mine was the general manager for 40-some years, one of the finest places in the world. They have an author's wing. It's a beautiful place to write. You're looking over the magnificent Chao Phraya River, and you can sit at your desk and write. If you've been there, you know it's a splendid place. But as soon as you come out of that, about 20 paces ahead, all the guys are marketing all the stuff you can imagine. And there's a fellow I watch coming in the morning at dawn, and he'll take his incense sticks and move it around the shrine, and then take some fruit and put it there and plant it over there. And then a little later in the day, about 6 in the evening, when you walk by, he dips into his pocket as every tourist walks by and unfurls a slew of pictures of unclad men and women, asking if you'd like to go there for the night out. And he said, would you like a happy hour? So one day I stopped him. They know me from going there. I said, I feel very badly for you that you have only 1 hour that's happy every day. I said, is that all you got to give? One happy hour? I said, I'm happy every hour of the day. So after that, every time I go by, he calls all his friends. There's the man who's happy every hour of the day, you know. So I stopped him. I said, I have a question for you. I said, you know, I look out of my window in the morning. You take the incense and you take some fruit and you place it right by that shrine there. Am I right? He said, yes. I said, then what are you doing at the end of the day? Unfurling all this stuff and selling the bodies of young men and young women. I said, I'm a Christian. You may not be, but I can tell you this. Gautama Buddha would not be very proud of you. He was just stunned. There is no intrinsic worth in merely ethical religions, because you see, ethical systems find ways of dodging the bullet, and whatever you do, you say, I will pay it in the next life, or I will do it this way, or do it that way. And the truth of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, when the Bible tells you and me that you are created imago Dei, the image of God, it pays you and me the greatest compliment. Immediately after that conversation comes another one. That was pitting law against law. This is pitting politics against politics. So they look at him and they say to him, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar, to Jesus? It's one question I so dearly wish Jesus had answered differently. Because on April 15th, you could be both rebellious and religious at the same time. And Jesus looked at him and said, do you have a coin? And a man said, yes. He said, give it to me. He said, whose image do you see on this coin? He said, it's Caesar's. He says, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give to God that which is God's. The man should have had a follow-up question. The follow-up question would have been, what belongs to God? And Jesus would have said, whose image is on you? You are created as a being of intrinsic worth. And the Ten Commandments basically tell you this, that your life is sacred, and all of your possessions and your activities ought to express that sacredness with which God has endowed you. Your marriage is sacred, your property is sacred, your word should be sacred, your worship sacred, and that is the heart of what Christ really points to. And so in the created order, I find that intrinsic worth, and I also have beyond that the reflective splendor. Now this is an important point. While we share with our fellow human beings all that is common in the intrinsic worth, we have what we call in the microcosm of our lives relationships that bring about a reflective splendor, either of a family or of the family tree. However you want to take it, there are particularities of value to your life and mine in a relationship more than it is just in a generality. And this is true. Well, Prime Minister Konoye of Japan, when he committed suicide, had on his night table Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, and when they found his body the next morning, they noticed the book was turned face down, and when they turned it up, he had underlined the words of what that Wilde had used there. As terrible as it was what I had done to the world, nothing was as terrible as what I had done to myself. You are a creature of value to God. You're also an entity of value to particular people in particular relationships who will care for you and walk the extra mile. My wife would have been here at this set of meetings, but she's in Toronto, Canada right now, taking care of a 96-year-old mother who was hit by a car. And she's been standing by the side of her mother for almost nonstop for the last 6 weeks. How can I leave my mom? I have to be there. Go to the other end of the spectrum, my little grandson, Jude, who is 4 now, several months ago, and he's three and a half or so, he's running around the house playing, and his mother can't find her car keys, and so she stops, my daughter Naomi stops, slaps her forehead and says, I must be losing my mind. And this little boy comes and stands in front of her and says, Mommy, whatever you do, please don't ever lose your heart, because I'm in there. From the age of a 96-year-old mother who needs her daughter by her side to a little child, the Bible says, what is there in man that you're mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you visit him? Out of the mouths of infants and babes you have ordained praise. the reality of intrinsic worth. My son went to Taylor University, graduated from there some years ago. And it was a few years ago in Taylor that a real tragedy had taken place. It was in 2006, where some kids were coming back after a weekend with some staff and faculty. I forget all. They were in a van, and an errant truck crossed over the median, slammed into them. Most of them were just smashed and killed. One student survived. And so the coroner came, identified every one of them of all that had been, all the damage that was done. And there was a young girl by the name of Laura Van Ryn that was still living, and they called the Van Ryn family, and the Van Ryn family came and spent time by her bedside for days and days and weeks and weeks. If I remember the story correctly, Laura's boyfriend was also there through much of that time, but he kept saying, her answers are not making sense. Her answers are not making sense. And they would say to him, what do you expect? She's been so battered, the hair is matted, the face is distorted, the brain is affected. Give her time, give her time. He said, no, something is not right. So finally, one day in a very coherent conversation, she looks at them and says, I don't know why you keep calling me Laura. I'm not Laura. Say, then who are you? Says, my name is Whitney. My name is Whitney Sirac. Why do you keep calling me Laura? You're not my parents. Parents were stunned. They contacted the office and then contacted the coroner, only to find out that no DNA testing had been done. He instantly lost his job. This was Whitney Sirac. This was not Laura Van Ryn. The Sirac family had to be informed that the funeral that they had and buried their daughter was not really their daughter. It was Laura in that grave. That their daughter, Whitney, is really in the hospital room recovering. And so the Van Ryns pack up their bags and go to the grave. And the Siracs leave their home and come to visit their daughter, who's still alive. You see, there's a particularity to a life. And only God is big enough to give value to all of humanity and build a relationship with you individually so that you know you are cared for and loved, all of your shortcomings and weaknesses and frailties notwithstanding. When I left the hospital after having an attempt to take my life in Delhi, the doctor looked at me and said this, we've given you back your life, but we cannot make you want to live. I said, sir, that's been taken care of as well. When for the first time a Bible had been opened up before me, the beautiful thing about the teaching of Jesus Christ is the reminder to you and to me that the relationship he offers is a personal one, your individual worth and your individual value. And so when we see the essential intrinsic worth, we also see a reflective splendor.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 921-939, Norcross, Georgia, 30010.
People are interested in having a spiritual life, but treat faith more like an a la carte menu at a restaurant, choosing what they like and dismissing the rest. Cutting through the hype and seduction is the clear voice